The world had condensed into a single, miserable sensation: the cold. It was a deep, marrow-chilling cold that the relentless Italian rain carried with it, a dampness that seeped through wool greatcoats, through leather boots, and into the very spirit of every man stationed in that God-forsaken valley. The 12th of November, 1943, was not a date marked on a calendar for any significant battle or strategic victory. It was simply another day in the long, grinding agony of the Italian campaign, a day where the primary enemy seemed less the German artillery nestled in the distant hills, and more the pervasive, soul-crushing wetness that defined existence. The landscape was a painting done only in mud and gloom, a monochrome of brown earth, grey sky, and the dull green of waterlogged uniforms. Trees were skeletal silhouettes against the low clouds, and the roads were rivers of churned, viscous mud that grabbed at the wheels of trucks and the boots of men with a sucking, hungry sound. This was the environment that surrounded the 33rd Field Hospital, a sprawling, temporary city of canvas and desperation that hummed with a strained, frantic energy, a fragile bastion of order against the chaotic entropy of war. The air inside the main surgical tent was a thick, palpable entity, a complex and assaulting mixture of smells that told the story of what happened here more eloquently than any after-action report. It was the sharp, clean, almost violent scent of antiseptic alcohol and ether, constantly fighting a losing battle against the richer, more primal odors of blood, both fresh and old, the cloying sweetness of pus and infection, the faint, foul hint of gangrene, and the overwhelming base human smell of sweat, fear, and voided bowels. Underneath it all was the damp, earthy smell of the mud they tracked in, and the faint, oily smell of diesel from the generators that powered the lights. This was the atmosphere, the very medium through which life moved in this place, a heavy, sickly air that clung to the back of the throat and settled in the lungs. The sounds that filled the vast space were a symphony of suffering, a relentless opera of human trauma playing on an endless loop. There was no silence here, only varying degrees of noise. The constant, low background hum was a chorus of moans and whimpers, the sound of men trying to endure, to contain their pain within themselves, a desperate attempt at dignity in the most undignified of circumstances. This was punctuated by sharp, staccato cries, sudden eruptions of agony that cut through the din like a knife, often followed by a swift, merciful hiss of a morphine syringe or the firm, shushing sound of a nurse's calm voice. The doctors and surgeons provided the clinical, dispassionate melody to this symphony, their voices crisp and clear, calling out for instruments, for clamps, for more plasma, their tones flat and focused, a necessary emotional detachment that was the only way to survive the sheer volume of carnage. The rhythmic, squeaking sound of rubber soles on the damp wooden planks laid over the mud was the percussion section, the sound of orderlies and nurses moving with purpose, while the heavier, booted tread of the walking wounded provided a slower, more mournful beat. And weaving through it all, a constant, terrifying bass note, was the distant, muffled thud of artillery, a reminder that this hospital was not a sanctuary, but merely a pause in the violence, a place so close to the front that the war's heartbeat could still be felt and heard. It was into this overwhelming sensory landscape that Private First Class Leo Murphy was unceremoniously deposited, a single, insignificant particle swept along in a river of pain. Leo felt his own smallness with a crushing intensity. At 19, he had left behind the vast, open skies of Kansas, where the horizons were endless and the air was clean and dry. Here, the world had closed in, reduced to the walls of a muddy trench, the sight of his rifle's barrel, and the constant, gnawing fear in his gut. He was not a hero, he was a replacement, a body sent to fill a hole left by another body that had been broken or destroyed. He had no grand tales of valor, only a collection of terrifying memories that played behind his eyes when he tried to sleep. The deafening crack of a shell landing too close, the sight of his friend, Joe, suddenly slumping forward without a sound, the feeling of cold mud against his cheek as he pressed himself into the earth, praying to become invisible. Now, he sat on a rough wooden crate that had once held mortar rounds, clutching his left forearm, which throbbed with a deep, persistent ache. The wound was a testament to his own clumsiness and bad luck, not his bravery. During a disorderly retreat from a patch of woods that had become a death trap, he had scrambled over a collapsed stone wall, a relic of a peaceful farm that no longer existed. A sharp, jagged piece of that wall, unseen in the panic and the twilight, had ripped through his sleeve and carved a deep, messy gash into the muscle of his forearm. It was a painful, bloody, and stupid injury. As he looked around the tent, at the men missing limbs, with abdominal wounds, with faces swathed in bandages, he was consumed by a hot wave of shame. He was an imposter, wasting the precious time and resources of the medical staff. He felt the judgmental eyes of the more seriously wounded, though in reality most were too lost in their own pain to even notice him. He kept his head down, his gaze fixed on the intricate, dried patterns of Italian mud on his boots, each crack and line a map of the misery he had traversed. It was from this posture of self-effacement that he first saw her, and the sight struck him with the force of a physical impact, momentarily silencing the cacophony in his mind. She moved through the forest of cots and suffering not like the other nurses, who navigated the chaos with a grim, determined efficiency that bordered on brusqueness, but with a calm, deliberate grace that seemed to alter the space around her. She did not rush. She flowed. There was an unhurried certainty to her movements that suggested a deep, internal reservoir of peace, a peace so potent it could impose a small pocket of order onto the surrounding bedlam. She was not tall, but her posture was perfect, her spine straight, her shoulders set with a quiet authority that commanded respect without a word being spoken. Her uniform, the same practical, drab wool as all the others, was somehow immaculate, the lines sharp and clean, a small but defiant act of order in a world of dissolution. Her hair, the colour of sun-bleached straw, was pinned up in a strict, professional style beneath her white cap, but the relentless humidity of the tent had coaxed a few gentle, rebellious strands to escape, curling in soft, damp tendrils against the pale skin of her neck and temples. Her face was a study in serene composure, with high cheekbones and a jawline that spoke of quiet strength, her mouth set in a line that was neither a smile nor a frown, but an expression of profound focus. But it was her eyes that truly captivated Leo, that held him frozen in his seat from 20 feet away. They were a clear, luminous grey, the colour of a sea under a misty sky, and they possessed a depth of empathy and intelligence that seemed to look past the external wounds, the blood, the grime, and see directly into the heart of the suffering individual. She did not just see a wounded soldier, she saw a person. He watched, utterly transfixed, as she approached a young soldier lying on a cot, a boy who looked even younger than Leo. This boy was not physically mangled in an obvious way, but he was trembling uncontrollably, his body vibrating with a violence that seemed it might shake him apart. His eyes were wide open, but they saw nothing in the present. They were fixed on some internal horror, replaying a moment of terror on an endless loop. He was muttering, a stream of incoherent, desperate words, fragments of prayers, the names of his mother and father, pleas for it to stop. His hands fluttered and spasmed, clawing at the rough wool blanket as if trying to dig his way to safety. The nurse did not recoil from this raw, unsettling display of shattered nerves. She did not call for orderlies to restrain him. She simply knelt beside his cot, her movements slow and deliberate, and placed her hands over his, enveloping his frantic, twitching fingers with her own. Her touch was not forceful, but it was firm, an anchor point in his storm. She began to speak to him. Leo was too far away to make out the words, but the tone of her voice cut through the oppressive noise of the tent like a blade of pure, clear light. It was low, steady, and imbued with an unshakable, absolute calm. It was the voice of a lighthouse keeper in a gale, steady and reassuring. It did not dismiss his fear. It simply sat with it, acknowledged it, and refused to be intimidated by it. Leo watched, his own breath held, as a miracle unfolded. The soldier's violent trembling began to subside, the frantic movements of his hands stilling under the gentle pressure of hers. His wild, unseeing eyes slowly lost their frantic glaze and focused on her face, clinging to her presence as if it were the only real thing in the universe. She remained there, kneeling, her hands on his, her voice a continuous, soft murmur for what felt like an eternity, until the boy's body finally relaxed, spent, and a fragile, Exhausted peace settled over his features. He was not cured, but he was safe, for now. In that moment, to Leo, she was more than a nurse. She was a living sacrament, a testament to the enduring power of compassion in a world that had actively chosen brutality. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. When his own name was called out by a harried-looking orderly, the spell was broken, and a different kind of tension seized him. His heart began to pound against his ribcage, a frantic, wild drumbeat that made him lightheaded. He was directed to a folding chair near a makeshift workstation, a simple wooden table laden with metal trays of gleaming, terrifying instruments, rolls of bandages, and brown bottles of antiseptic. He sat down, his posture stiff, clutching his wounded arm as if it were a ticket to something precious. He felt like a fraud about to be exposed, a schoolboy summoned to the principal's office for a transgression he had not yet committed. And then she was there. The space around him seemed to shift, the light from the hanging kerosene lamps seeming to brighten and focus solely on her. She stood before him, her grey eyes performing a quick, comprehensive scan, taking in his dirty, anxious face, his mud-caked uniform, the bloody, makeshift bandage on his arm. She did not smile, but her expression was not unkind or impatient. It was one of complete and total presence. In a place of 1,000 distractions, 1,000 demands on her attention, she was giving him, for these few minutes, her entire focus. It was a profound and unexpected gift. She reached for his arm. Her touch, as her fingers gently took his wrist to examine the wound, was cool and dry, a startling and pleasant contrast to his own clammy, feverish skin. Her hands, he saw, were not the soft, unused hands of a woman from a magazine. They were the hands of a worker, capable and strong, with long, slender fingers and short, practical nails. Yet there was no roughness to them. Their touch was incredibly gentle. The scent that accompanied her was a small, personal revolution. It was the clean, herbal fragrance of lavender soap and the sharp, clean smell of surgical spirit, a tiny bubble of purity and hygiene that pushed back the overwhelming stench of decay and death. It was the smell of a world he had almost forgotten, a world of cleanliness and order, of bathrooms and laundered sheets, of quiet kitchens and safety. It was the most wonderful smell he had encountered since leaving home. She began to clean the wound, her movements methodical and precise. With a pair of metal forceps, she carefully picked out tiny, embedded fragments of stone and wool from the torn flesh, her concentration absolute. Her brow was furrowed slightly, her full attention on the task. The antiseptic she applied next was a fire that raced along the raw nerves, a sharp, bright agony that made him gasp and his muscles tense. But Leo found that the pain was a distant thing, secondary to the experience of watching her. He was mesmerized by the smallest details, the way a tiny pulse beat in her throat, the delicate shape of her ears, the fine, almost invisible golden hairs on her forearm that caught the light. He noticed for the first time a very slight, almost imperceptible tremor in her left hand as she reached for a fresh square of gauze. It was a fleeting thing, there and then gone, a tiny crack in the flawless facade of her composure. This small sign of her own human vulnerability, her own fatigue and strain, did not diminish her in his eyes. It made her infinitely more real, more complex, more achingly beautiful. She was not a remote, untouchable angel. She was a woman, pushing herself to the absolute limits of her endurance day after day, to bring moments of grace into this hell. That realization forged a connection that felt deeper than any he had ever known. As she worked, carefully suturing the jagged edges of his skin together with neat, practiced stitches, a strange and profound transformation occurred within Leo. The constant, gnawing anxiety that had been his permanent state of being for months, the fear of death, the fear of failure, the cold, the hunger, the loss began to recede. Its volume turned down to a distant, manageable whisper. In this small, intimate bubble defined by the sphere of her presence, the war outside the canvas walls ceased to exist. The booming artillery, the memory of dead friends, the terror of the next attack, it all melted away. The universe shrank to the space between their two bodies, to the feeling of her cool, capable hands on his skin, to the sound of her quiet, even breathing, to the clean, life-affirming scent of her. In this space he was not Private First Class Murphy, rifleman. He was just Leo, a young man from Kansas, and she was just a kind, beautiful woman tending to a hurt. It was a simple, human connection, stripped of all context and ideology, and it felt more vital, more nourishing than any meal or any sleep he had had in this country. He felt a desperate, almost painful urge to preserve this feeling, to capture it in a bottle and keep it safe, a precious elixir to be sipped in the dark times he knew with certainty were still to come. She finished her work, tying off the suture with a neat, final knot. She applied a clean, white bandage, her fingers smoothing the adhesive tape with a gesture that felt like a blessing, a sealing of this temporary sanctuary. Then, she looked up from his arm, and her grey eyes met his. The connection was instantaneous and electric. For a timeless second, he felt utterly transparent, as if every layer of pretense and armour had been stripped away. He felt that she saw everything, not just the superficial shame of his minor wound, but the deep, abiding terror that lived in his heart. She saw the homesick boy who missed the vast, silent prairies and the smell of his mother's baking, the boy who was terrified of dying alone and being buried in this foreign soil, the boy who had seen things he could never forget and felt a guilt for simply being alive when others were not. In her gaze there was no judgment, no condescending pity. There was only a deep, weary, and boundless understanding, a recognition of a shared humanity in a world that was doing its utmost to destroy it. It was the look of one soul acknowledging another in the midst of the abyss. "Try to keep it clean, soldier," she said, her voice as low and steady as it had been with the shell-shocked boy. The words themselves were simple, practical, medical instructions, but in that charged moment they felt like a sacred vow, a poem of care. And then, the moment shattered. She turned away, her attention already shifting, her body already orienting itself toward the next folding chair, the next wounded boy, the next soul in need of her particular brand of salvation. She was gone, reabsorbed into the chaotic tapestry of the field hospital, leaving behind only the memory of her presence. Leo sat there for a long time, oblivious to the groans and movements around him, staring at the pristine white bandage on his arm. It was more than a medical dressing. It was a relic, a talisman, a physical anchor for a spiritual experience. The image of her face, the memory of her touch, the sound of her voice, they were not mere memories. They were sensations branded onto his consciousness with the searing intensity of a lightning strike. He was eventually given a slip of paper that granted him a 3-day reprieve from the front lines, a chit for light duty, and he shuffled out of the tent, back into the weeping rain and the clinging, hopeless mud. The external world was objectively unchanged, the same cold, the same danger, the same pervasive stink of war. But internally, everything was different. He carried within him a new, fiercely burning ember of light, a small, defiant sun in the vast, consuming darkness of the front. He did not know her name. He knew nothing of her life before this war, her hopes, her fears, but he knew, with a certainty that was as terrifying as it was exhilarating, that this encounter could not be the end. He had to see her again. The memory of the nurse with the grey eyes was no longer just a memory. It was an obsession taking root in the fertile soil of a soldier's profound loneliness and despair, a fragile, impossible flower beginning to bloom in the bitter, unforgiving winter of war. The world outside the canvas walls of the field hospital was a brutal and immediate shock to the system, a violent reassertion of a reality Leo had briefly been allowed to forget. The fragile peace he had found in the nurse's presence evaporated the moment his boots sank back into the cold, grasping mud of the camp. The 3 days of light duty passed not as a reprieve, but as a form of exquisite torture. He was assigned to a quartermaster's depot, sorting through crates of damp, mildewed socks and canned rations, tasks that were mind-numbingly boring but left his mind terrifyingly free to wander. And his mind, without fail, wandered back to her. The memory was no longer a simple recollection. It had become a compulsive ritual, a sacred text he reread in his mind 1,000 times a day. He would close his eyes and feel the ghost of her cool, dry touch on his wrist. He would inhale deeply, trying to catch a phantom trace of lavender and soap amidst the overwhelming stench of mud, damp wool, and men. He would hear the distant rumble of artillery, and beneath it, imagine the steady, calming cadence of her voice. The image of her face, the slight tremor in her hand, The clear grey of her eyes, these fragments of a 5-minute interaction, became the central pillars of his existence, the only things that held any colour or meaning in a world that had been stripped bare of both. This obsession did not exist in a vacuum. It grew in the fertile, poisoned soil of the front-line experience. When his light duty ended, he was sent back to his unit, a rifle company dug into a series of waterlogged trenches facing a German position on a ridge. Life regressed to its primal rhythm, a constant, low-grade terror punctuated by moments of sheer, unadulterated panic. The days were a monotony of standing watch in the rain, cleaning rifles that were instantly refouled with mud, and eating cold, tasteless food from a can. The nights were worse, filled with the strange, unsettling sounds of no man's land, the fear of a patrol, the sudden, blinding illumination of a flare that turned the world into a stark tableau of black and white, revealing shadows that might be men or might be stumps. Death was no longer an abstract concept, it was a casual, random occurrence. A man 2 trenches over would stand up to stretch his legs, and a single, crackling sniper's bullet would punch him backwards into the mud, his life extinguished with less ceremony than snuffing out a candle. The constant exposure to this arbitrary horror had a numbing effect on most of the men, but for Leo it had the opposite consequence. It made the memory of the nurse, that single point of human warmth and compassion, burn all the more brightly. She was the antithesis of all this. She represented order instead of chaos, care instead of destruction, life instead of this pervasive, casual death. She was a sanctuary. And his soul, starved and battered, craved that sanctuary with a desperation that began to overshadow every other instinct, even the instinct for self-preservation. The idea did not come to him in a single, dramatic flash of inspiration. It was a slow, insidious growth, a weed that took root in the dark corners of his mind and gradually spread until it choked out all other reasoning. It began as a fantasy, a simple, hopeless daydream. What if he were wounded again? Not seriously, of course. Nothing that would cripple him or send him home in disgrace. Just a minor injury. A clean, respectable wound. Something that would necessitate a trip back to the field hospital, a new bandage, a few moments in her presence. It was a guilty thought, and he would push it away, feeling a flush of shame, but the thought was persistent. It would return during the long, cold nights on watch, as he stared into the impenetrable blackness. It would whisper to him while he huddled in his dugout, listening to the shells scream overhead. The fantasy became a detailed mental rehearsal. He would imagine the entire sequence, the journey in the ambulance, the smell of the tent, the nervous anticipation, and then the sight of her. He would imagine her cool hands on his skin, her focused expression, the sound of her voice. In his daydream, it was perfect, a brief return to that state of grace. But the transition from fantasy to plan was a subtle, dark alchemy. It was fueled by a specific, crushing incident. A patrol went out, a routine, terrifying foray into no man's land. Leo was not on it. He watched from the trench as the 12 men, faces blackened, moved like ghosts into the darkness. He listened to the silence, broken only by the distant, sporadic machine gun fire. Hours later, the sound of a furious, close-range firefight erupted, a violent storm of cracking rifles and chattering automatics that lasted for less than a minute before silence fell again, heavier and more profound than before. Only 6 men stumbled back into the trench, one of them dragging another who was screaming, his leg a bloody ruin. The missing 6 were just gone, swallowed by the night and the mud. One of them was a boy from Alabama named Charlie, who had, just that afternoon, been showing Leo a wrinkled photograph of his girlfriend back home. The sheer random finality of it, the erasure of a life with such brutal efficiency, shattered something inside Leo. The fear that had been a constant companion curdled into a deep, existential dread. He felt the fragility of his own life with a new, terrifying clarity. He could be next. He could be nothing, just a name on a casualty list, a body left to rot in the mud. And in the face of that terrifying nothingness, the memory of the nurse became more than a comfort. It became a reason to grasp at one more moment of humanity, one more feeling of connection before the darkness could claim him. The plan solidified in his mind, no longer a guilty daydream but a concrete course of action. It was a betrayal, he knew, a betrayal of his comrades, of the army, of the very concept of duty. It was a sin of selfishness in a world that demanded self-sacrifice. The guilt was a physical weight in his stomach, a cold stone that sat there day and night. But the longing, the desperate, aching need to see her again, was a fever in his blood, and it burned hotter than the guilt. He began to study his own body, his environment, with a new, clinical detachment. He needed a wound that was convincing but not catastrophic. It had to be visible, to bleed, to look painful, but it could not endanger his life or limb. He ruled out anything with a firearm. That was too unpredictable, too final. It had to be an accident, something plausible in the chaotic, hazardous environment of the trench line. The opportunity presented itself 2 days later. They were improving a section of the trench, shoring up the collapsing walls with sandbags and wooden planks. A stack of unused corrugated iron sheets, salvaged from a destroyed farm building, lay nearby, their edges rusted and sharp. As he and another soldier moved a heavy timber, he deliberately let his foot slip in the mud, stumbling sideways and allowing his left calf to drag heavily against the jagged, teeth-like edge of one of the metal sheets. It was not a gentle scrape. He put his full, stumbling weight into it, and the sharp metal tore through his wool trousers and into the flesh beneath. The pain was instant and searing, a bright, white-hot line of agony that made him cry out, this time for real. He collapsed into the mud, clutching his leg, and when he pulled his hand away, it was covered in blood. The other soldiers rushed over, their faces concerned. It was a perfect, believable accident. The gash was deep and messy, bleeding profusely, a convincing spectacle of injury. As they helped him to the aid station, the initial, sharp pain was already being subsumed by a swirling vortex of other emotions. There was the shock of the self-inflicted violence, a strange, dissociative feeling of having betrayed his own body. There was a fresh, more potent wave of guilt as he saw the genuine concern in his comrade's eyes. But overriding it all, pulsing through him with the frantic rhythm of his own heartbeat, was a dark, thrilling anticipation. It was working. He was going back. The journey to the field hospital was a blur of jolting motion and internal turmoil. The ambulance ride was a repetition of the sounds and smells he remembered, but this time they were underscored by the drumbeat of his own deception. He was processed through the same triage point, his wound assessed by the same harried corpsman, who barely glanced at it before marking his chart and sending him to the same waiting area for the walking wounded. The environment was exactly as he remembered, yet it felt completely different. The smells of antiseptic and blood, which had once been symbols of a terrifying reality, now felt like the aromas of a longed-for destination. The moans of the wounded were no longer just sounds of suffering. They were the background music to his own personal, treacherous drama. He found a spot on a bench, his heart hammering so violently he was sure everyone around him could hear it. He kept his head down, not out of shame for a minor wound this time, but out of a fear that someone would look into his eyes and see the lie lurking there. He was an actor waiting in the wings, about to step onto a stage for a performance upon which he felt his very sanity depended. And then he saw her. She emerged from behind a canvas partition, her arms full of fresh linen. His breath caught in his throat. She was exactly as he remembered, yet the sight of her in the flesh was a fresh shock to his system. The calm grace of her movements, the serene focus of her expression, it was all there, a living embodiment of the image he had been worshipping in his mind. The days of longing, the fear, the self-inflicted pain, all coalesced into a single, overpowering wave of emotion that left him trembling. He watched her as she moved down the line, tending to the other men. He saw her kneel before a soldier with a bandaged head, speaking to him in that same low, steady voice. He saw her gentle touch as she adjusted an IV line. Every gesture, every look, confirmed the perfection of the memory and deepened his own sense of unworthiness. He was a contaminant in her world of genuine care, a liar seeking truth. Finally, she stood before him. Her grey eyes swept over him, and for a terrifying second he was convinced she knew. He was sure she could see the deception written on his face, could smell the calculation on him. but her expression remained the same, professional, focused, present. She knelt down to examine his leg. Her fingers were just as cool, just as sure, as they probed the edges of the gash. The pain was sharp and real, but once again, it was secondary. He was back inside the bubble. The sounds of the hospital faded, the guilt receded, and there was only the intense, overwhelming reality of her proximity. He watched the top of her head as she worked, the neat part in her wheat-coloured hair, the way she bit her lip in concentration. He inhaled the clean, life-giving scent of her. This was the moment he had orchestrated, the moment he had mutilated himself to achieve. And in its achievement he felt not triumph, but a profound and unsettling ambiguity. He had gotten what he wanted, but the cost of it, the fundamental dishonesty of it, stained the experience. He was not a patient receiving care. He was a thief, stealing a moment of her compassion under false pretenses. She cleaned the wound with the same meticulous care she had shown his arm. The antiseptic burned, a penance for his sin. She did not speak until she began to suture. Her voice, when it came, was soft, meant only for him. This is a nasty one. The edges are very ragged. It was a simple, clinical observation, but to Leo, it felt like an indictment. She was commenting on the violence he had willingly done to himself. He could only nod, his throat too tight to form words. She worked in silence for a few minutes, the needle and thread pulling his skin back together. Then she spoke again, her voice still low, but her words were not about the wound. "It's a hard thing," she said, not looking up from her work, "to be surrounded by so much breaking. Sometimes the mind looks for an anchor, any anchor." Leo's blood ran cold. His heart seemed to stop in his chest. She wasn't looking at him, but her words felt like a key turning in the lock of his soul. It was as if she were speaking directly to the motivation he had so carefully hidden, acknowledging the desperation without condemning it. She was offering not a diagnosis of his physical injury, but a diagnosis of his spiritual one. She was giving him an out, a framework of understanding that absolved him of his specific crime by recognizing the universal desperation that had caused it. In that moment, she was not just tending to his leg, she was offering a form of absolution for the lie itself. She finished the bandaging and looked up, her grey eyes meeting his. There was no accusation in them, only that same deep, weary understanding he had seen before, but now it felt infinitely more personal, more directed. She saw the boy who was so terrified of the breaking world that he would break himself to find a moment of peace. She saw his lie, and she was choosing to treat the deeper wound that had caused it. She did not smile, but her gaze was a gentle, unspoken acknowledgement of the unspoken truth between them. "Try to stay safe out there," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The words were the same as before, but the meaning had changed. It was no longer a generic farewell. It was a plea for him not to do this again, a plea for him to find a better way to survive. He left the tent on crutches, the pain in his leg a real and throbbing reminder of his actions, but the greater pain was in his heart. He had seen her again. He had been close to her, had felt her touch, had heard her voice. The desperate hunger had been momentarily sated, but the cost had been immense. He had not only lied to the army and his comrades, he had forced this woman, this symbol of pure compassion, to become an unwitting accomplice in his deception. He had contaminated the very sanctuary he sought. The joy of seeing her was now forever intertwined with the shame of the lie. The anchor he had so desperately sought had been found, but it was attached to a chain of guilt that threatened to pull him down into a deeper darkness than the one he had been trying to escape. The obsession was not cured, it was merely complicated, its simple longing now corrupted by a profound and inescapable moral consequence. The return to the front line after the second, self-orchestrated wound was a descent into a new and more profound circle of hell. The physical pain in Leo's leg was a constant, throbbing reminder of his action, a dull ache that pulsed in time with his heartbeat, a metronome counting out his guilt. But the greater agony was psychological, a corrosive shame that seeped into his every thought and poisoned his every interaction. The world had not changed, but his perception of it had been permanently altered. The mud was not just mud, It was the grimy substance he had wallowed in through his own deceit. The concerned faces of his comrades were not a comfort. They were silent accusations. When the sergeant clapped him on the back and said he was lucky it wasn't worse, Leo felt the words like a physical blow. Luck had nothing to do with it. It had been a calculated, desperate choice, and the weight of that choice was crushing him. The memory of the nurse was no longer a simple, pure source of comfort. It had become a complex and painful amalgamation of longing, ecstasy, and self-loathing. He would close his eyes and feel the ghost of her touch on his leg, the cool certainty of her hands, and a wave of desperate yearning would wash over him. But immediately on its heels would come the image of her grey eyes, so full of that deep, understanding sadness, and he would hear her whispered words. Sometimes the mind looks for an anchor. She had seen through him, not all the way, perhaps, but enough. She had perceived the desperation beneath the physical wound, and in her infinite compassion, she had chosen not to expose him, but to offer a silent, heartbreaking absolution. This knowledge did not relieve his guilt. It magnified it 1,000-fold. He had not just lied, he had manipulated the compassion of the one person in this war who represented unconditional goodness. He had taken her sacred duty and made it an accessory to his own selfishness. The sanctuary had been violated, and he was the violator. His obsession now took on a darker, more frantic character. It was no longer a quiet longing, it was a gnawing hunger, a compulsive need for validation that he knew, on some level, could never be fulfilled. He began to construct elaborate fantasies not of another meeting, but of redemption. He would imagine performing some act of incredible, undisputable heroism. He would single-handedly storm a machine gun nest or pull a dozen wounded men from a burning vehicle, earning a medal, a citation, the respect of his entire company. And then, wounded honorably this time, he would be carried into her tent. She would look at him, and her eyes would not hold that sad understanding, but a new light of respect, of admiration. He would have earned her care, earned the right to be in her presence. These fantasies were his only escape from the crushing weight of his reality, but they were a poison in themselves, for they highlighted the vast chasm between the man he was and the man he wished he could be. The external pressures of the war began to intensify, mirroring the internal storm raging within him. The Germans launched a series of localized counterattacks, and the company was pushed to its absolute limit. Days blurred into nights filled with the relentless thunder of artillery barrages and the piercing, desperate cries of men fighting for their lives in the mud. Sleep became a forgotten luxury, replaced by brief, fitful moments of exhausted unconsciousness, often interrupted by the scream of incoming shells or the frantic call to stand to. Rations ran low, and the cold seemed to deepen, seeping into bones already weary beyond measure. In this crucible of sustained terror and exhaustion, the men's nerves were stretched to the breaking point. The casual camaraderie began to fray, replaced by a sharp, irritable tension. Small mistakes were met with explosive anger. The constant grinding stress was an acid, eating away at the last vestiges of their humanity. It was in this atmosphere that the first seeds of suspicion were sown. A burly corporal from Brooklyn, a man named Finnerty, whose face was permanently set in a scowl, made a casual, off-hand remark as they were digging a new latrine trench. He nodded toward Leo's leg. "That's a hell of a scrape, Murphy. You sure you didn't just fall on your own bayonet to get out of this mess?" It was meant as a joke, the kind of dark, grim humour that was the currency of the trenches. But to Leo, it felt like a dagger to the heart. His face flushed hot, and he stumbled over his words, his response a clumsy, too forceful denial that was more telling than any confession. Finnerty just shrugged and went back to digging, but Leo saw the flicker of a new, calculating look in the man's eyes. The casual comment had landed on the fertile ground of Leo's own guilt, and it began to grow. From that moment on, Leo became paranoid. He saw suspicion in every glance, heard accusation in every casual question. When the mail was distributed and he received nothing, he was sure the others saw it as proof he had no one who cared for him, a man who would therefore be capable of anything. When he volunteered for a dangerous ration run, he did it not out of bravery, but out of a desperate need to prove his courage to himself and to the invisible, judging eyes of his comrades. He moved through the trench like a ghost, his mind a frantic, divided thing. One part focused on the very real danger of death from the enemy, the other consumed by the fictional narrative of his own deception and the terrifying, all-consuming need for the nurse's absolution. The breaking point came during a particularly brutal mortar attack. The world dissolved into noise and concussion, the air thick with the smell of cordite and flying earth. Men were screaming, orders were being shouted, and the world was a chaos of violent, random death. Leo huddled at the bottom of the trench, pressing himself into the mud, his hands over his helmet, praying to a god he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. Next to him, a young private, a new replacement they called Kid, was sobbing uncontrollably, his face a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. As a mortar round landed terrifyingly close, showering them with dirt and debris, the Kid completely broke. He scrambled to his feet, screaming that he couldn't take it anymore, and began to claw his way up the back of the trench, intent on running, on escaping the madness, a surefire suicide mission. Without thinking, Leo lunged forward, grabbing the boy by his webbing and hauling him back down into the relative safety of the trench. The Kid fought him, flailing and screaming, but Leo held on, pinning him to the muddy wall, speaking to him in low, urgent tones, not unlike the way the nurse had spoken to the shell-shocked soldier. "It's all right. It's all right. Just breathe. Look at me. Just breathe." He held the boy until the panic attack subsided, until the frantic struggling gave way to limp, exhausted trembling. When the barrage finally lifted, the Kid looked at Leo with a gaze of pure, wordless gratitude. The other soldiers who had witnessed it nodded at him, a new respect in their eyes. For a moment, Leo felt a surge of something genuine, something clean. He had done a good thing. He had acted with courage and compassion, but the feeling was fleeting. As the adrenaline faded, the old obsession rushed back in, twisting the event, corrupting it. This act of spontaneous bravery became, in his tormented mind, not a testament to his character, but merely a down payment on his next sin. It was a credit he could now use to offset the guilt of his planned return. The thought was now fully formed, a dark, determined certainty. He would go back. One more time. He had to. He needed to see her not as a fraudulent supplicant, but after having proven his worth, even in some small way. He needed to see if the look in her eyes would be different. The compulsion was a physical force, a fever in his brain that overrode all logic, all morality, all sense of self-preservation. The war outside was a tempest of steel and fire, but the war inside Leo Murphy was nearing its terrible, inevitable climax. The anchor he clung to was now pulling him inexorably into the abyss. The plan for the third wound was born not from desperation, but from a chilling, cold-blooded resignation. It was to be the final act, the culmination of his tragic, self-destructive drama. He would not stumble. He would not fall. He would create a wound that was unambiguous, an injury that no one could question, one that would necessitate a longer stay at the field hospital, perhaps even evacuation to a proper hospital further from the front. He chose a spot on the outer part of his thigh, an area of dense muscle where a deep cut would bleed dramatically but was unlikely to hit a major artery. The instrument would be a piece of shrapnel from a dud German shell that had been recovered and left as a morbid souvenir near the command post. It was a twisted, jagged piece of steel, cruel and impersonal. He would claim he fell on it during a nighttime patrol in the tangled wire of no man's land. It was a story that was dangerous enough to be believable, yet chaotic enough to be unverifiable. The night he chose was moonless and choked with a thick, freezing fog that deadened sound and reduced visibility to a few feet. It was perfect. His heart was a cold, hard stone in his chest as he waited for his watch. There was no excitement, no anticipation, only a grim, fatalistic determination. He had passed beyond guilt, beyond fear, into a state of eerie emotional numbness. He was a machine executing its final program. When the moment came, he was alone in a deserted section of the forward trench. He took the cold, heavy piece of shrapnel in his hand, its sharp edges biting into his palm. He took a deep breath, the air frigid in his lungs, and with a swift, brutal, and deliberate motion, he dragged the metal across his upper thigh, putting all his weight into it. The pain was blinding, a white-hot sheet of agony that eclipsed everything. He cried out, a genuine, guttural scream that was torn from him by the sheer, shocking violence of the act. He collapsed into the mud, clutching his leg, feeling the warm, swift rush of blood soaking through his trousers and over his fingers. This was no superficial gash. This was a deep, serious wound. The pain was so intense it made him nauseous, his vision swimming at the edges. He began to shout for a medic, his voice weak and strained. The sounds of running boots, of concerned shouts, reached him as if from a great distance. He was lifted, jostled, the pain flaring with every movement. Through a haze of agony, he felt a grim sense of accomplishment. He had done it. The lie was now carved into his own flesh, a permanent, terrible testament to his obsession. The journey to the field hospital was a nightmare of pain and confusion. He drifted in and out of consciousness, the world a blur of noise and motion. When he finally arrived, the processing was a swift, urgent blur. His wound was assessed as serious, and he was rushed past the waiting area, directly into a pre-operative staging area. The chaos was greater than he had ever seen it. A major push had begun, and the hospital was overflowing with casualties. The air was thick with the smell of blood, and the frantic energy of a medical staff pushed to the absolute limit. He was laid on a stretcher on the floor, waiting for a surgeon to become available. Through the swirling, pain-filled fog, his eyes scanned the room, searching for her. He had to see her. He had to know she was here, that this ultimate sacrifice had not been in vain, and then he saw her. She was moving between the stretchers, her face pale and drawn, but her movements still possessed that same core of unshakable calm. She was holding the hand of a soldier who had lost both his legs, her voice a soft, steady murmur as a doctor worked frantically to stop the bleeding. Leo watched her, and the numbness that had encased his heart began to crack. The sheer scale of the real suffering surrounding him, the true, unvarnished horror of war, crashed down upon him with the weight of a mountain. His own wound, his self-inflicted, calculated injury, felt obscene in this context. It was a blasphemy. He was a fake among the truly broken, a liar stealing resources from the dying. His eyes met hers across the crowded, bloody room. She was still holding the dying soldier's hand, but her gaze was fixed on Leo. There was no recognition at first, just the professional assessment of a new casualty. But then, as she took in his face, her expression changed. It was not the sad understanding of before. It was something else, something deeper and more devastating. It was a look of profound, heartbroken disappointment. It was the look a mother might give a child who has committed an unforgivable sin. In that single, silent look, all his fantasies, all his justifications, crumbled to dust. She knew with absolute certainty that this was no accident. She saw the truth written not just in his eyes, but in the very nature of the wound, in the timing of it, in the desperate, hollow look on his face. The connection between them, the fragile thread he had been clinging to, did not strengthen. It snapped. He looked away, unable to bear the weight of her gaze. The physical pain in his leg was nothing compared to the spiritual agony that now consumed him. He had sought her as an anchor, but in his desperation, he had become a ship deliberately scuttling itself on the rocks. He had wanted to be worthy of her compassion, but in the process he had made himself utterly unworthy of it. A surgeon finally reached him, his face a mask of exhaustion. He cut away Leo's trousers, examined the deep, jagged gash, and began to clean it. The pain was excruciating, but Leo welcomed it. It was a penance. As the doctor worked, an orderly came by with a clipboard, checking tags. He stopped at Leo's feet. "Murphy, Leo, 29th Division?" Leo grunted in affirmation. The orderly made a note. "Right, you're on the list for the morning evacuation train to Naples. That leg needs proper surgery and a long recovery. Your war's over, soldier." The words should have been a deliverance. They were the very outcome he had, on some level, been hoping to achieve. A ticket away from the front, away from the mud and the death. But they felt like a sentence. He was being sent away, not as a hero, but as a living monument to his own cowardice and deceit. He was escaping the war, but he was carrying the battlefield within him. He was loaded onto a truck and taken to a railhead, where a long train of converted boxcars waited to take the wounded to the coast. As he was carried on a stretcher towards the train, he saw her one last time. She was standing at the entrance to the main tent, taking a rare, brief moment of respite, a cup of water in her hand. She was looking right at him. There were no more words, no more looks of understanding or disappointment. Her face was simply empty, drained of all emotion, a beautiful, pale mask of pure exhaustion. She had given everything she had, and in his selfishness, he had taken a little more. He had been just one more wound to tend to in an endless river of wounds, but he was the only one who had chosen to be there. As the train pulled away, jolting him painfully on his stretcher, Leo finally allowed the tears to come. They were not tears of self-pity, but tears of a final, searing clarity. He had pretended to be wounded just to see a nurse again, and in doing so, he had inflicted upon himself a wound that would never truly heal, a wound of the spirit far deeper than any piece of shrapnel or jagged steel could ever cause. He had learned the ultimate, terrible lesson, that in a world designed to break men, the most devastating breaks are often the ones we choose for ourselves. He had sought solace in a angel of mercy, and in his desperate, clumsy grasp, he had only succeeded in proving how far he had fallen from grace. The train carried him away from the war, away from the mud and the blood, but it carried him towards a future forever shadowed by the memory of the nurse's eyes and the devastating, silent truth they held.